Man, this game sure does things at times, and then those things happen, am I right? Hello, it's me. I did not in fact do absolutely nothing this week, no siree, but in the period of time where I was doing nothing, I was looking back in an old video called Powercreep and FEH has lost all meaning. Given all the recent changes over the course of book 8, I wanted to look back at that video just to see how much of it I still agree or disagree with, and generally speaking, there's some stuff that I think I still agree with, such as units requiring extra gimmicks to stand out nowadays, or needing more inheritable slots, and stuff that I don't really agree with as much, such as PureFs not really pushing the envelope or IS running out of ideas when it comes to their design space, since this year alone has shown how creative and uncreative they can get when it comes to both of these points. However, one aspect that I definitely lowballed was the amount of emphasis I put on skill creep, which was a fairly large focal point of the video. Much of the emphasis leaned more on the inheritable side, where newer skills will get one or more new effects, or combine a bunch of pre-existing skills into one to entice players into spending for them. That, or when newer units would drop, they would have something extra to stand out, usually in the form of a PureF skill, so that the difference was a lot more noticeable. This is what my idea of skill creep was relying on, without really thinking about how much of it could evolve beyond that point in time. And because of that, I completely underestimated the degree in which skill creep would really be pushed into the game, not only to the extent in which they'd show up on newer units, but also with how they'd evolve over time. As a result, skill creep has been on the forefront of power creep over the past year, more so than many of the weapons that have been released. Although whether you conflate the two terms or not, that's up to you, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to count them separately to some degree, despite both effectively relying on the same idea of pushing current limitations. Regardless, it's been here, and I'm sure many of you have recognized that by this point. Even if it's just through newer trailers or units showing up in the game every so often, you've definitely seen some units not only with their own exclusive weapon, but with an additional PureF skill attached to them. And not just a PureF skill, but a brand new one at that. And it's not as if this was the norm for a while either. There's definitely been an uptick in them over the past year or so. Let's compare Book 7's and Book 8's heroes that came with PureF skills. For the purposes of comparisons, we'll exclude all the legendaries and mythics and emblems, since they always come with a PureF and PureF skill, so it would kind of inflate the numbers when basically this has been a thing since they've been introduced. But regardless, here are all the Book 7 banners on screen right now, you know, with the exclusions applied. Of those banners, these are the banners that had units with PureF skills. Most of them were just from pre-existing versions of said unit, and many rearmed heroes that required one due to not having an exclusive weapon. So if we were to remove the banners that only contained recurring PureF skills, then this is what would be left. It's definitely a fair bit less. Now let's look at the current lineup of Book 8 banners. And granted, the book has not ended yet. We still have 2 banners left, just to keep that in mind. Of those banners, these are all the Book 8 banners that had PureF skills. Now, if I were to exclude the same stuff as I did in Book 7, this is what would be left. No, I did not forget to change the graphic. It is just the same amount. Every Book 8 banner, barring the Hoshido Summer Festival banner, at minimum, had a brand new PureF skill. That is a lot of new PureF skills added to the game, and it's clear that this is how they're going to push newer and newer stuff, since there's only so many things they could shove into a weapon at this point. And as far as where it began to spiral, it can be traced to either the T banner or Braves, but considering every Brave hero nowadays is guaranteed a PureF skill, I'm willing to suggest it started after CYL, since every subsequent banner had at least one brand new PureF skill on it, only barring the Halloween banner, of course. It makes me wonder if a lot of the newer changes can be traced to banners that occur after each CYL, but I don't think we've had anything on a similar level to my knowledge. CYL 7 itself also introduced a fair bit of changes that are still commonplace in the form of terrain skills and effects. It first started with the likes of Flared Sparrow and Stone Terrain from Corrin's PureF, and over the course of a year or so, we've gotten grass terrain, water terrain, flame, stones, ice terrains that are also through other means of PureFs, as well as more inheritables allowing for miasma and stones to be placed. I think these were definitely some of the more interesting changes put into FEH, since it expanded on how we interacted with the game itself, and rather than attempting to push the limits with weapons by adding newer or tacking on more effects, they've been expanding on how many can approach the game through other skill sets. slots. And I think because of this, there's been much more of an emphasis on skills over the past year than weapons. The design philosophy of modern PRFs hasn't really pushed the envelope nearly as much as the PRF skills themselves, I feel, and in some cases, units that are or were oppressive wouldn't be nearly as strong without them due to how much they rely on those over their actual weapons. Let's take Brave Felix and Emblem Ike for example. Brave Felix has a slaying -2 weapon with distant counter, adaptive, null guard, some stats, and damage reduction shredding, as well as a PRF skill in Lone Wolf that gives him 2 Gale Forces, stats, phantom speed, true damage reduction, and even more true damage reduction if a special goes off. Meanwhile, Emblem Mike has a slaying distant counter weapon with Null Sea Disrupt, stats, penalty neutralization, and null guard, with a PRF skill in Great Aether that deals a significant amount of damage based on the amount of attacks taken, a bunch of unpierceable DR that goes up to 70%, it inflicts Vantage and Desperation on the foe to ensure his special does more damage, Pulse Smoke, and after combat healing that chips nearby foes. Both of these units have a fair bit going for them, but it's clear that their PRF skills are much more overtuned comparatively to their weapons. And I would argue that if neither of these units had their PRF weapons but still retained their PRF skills, they'd still be extremely threatening. Meanwhile, if they had their PRF skills removed but kept their PRF weapons, then I don't think most people would fear them as much as they did or still do. Their weapons are not bad by any means, I want to make that abundantly clear, but I find that IS has been pushing the design space more with PRF skills than the weapons as of late. And when you consider all the PRF skills that have been released throughout the game since CY07, many of them are arguably contributing the most amount of work to a unit's performance. Of course, there are units that don't necessarily fall into that demographic or don't even have PRF skills at all that I would still look out for regardless and are still extremely strong in their own right. You know, units like Nifavalier or Nurgle, and similarly, some units would also go really crazy because of their weapon and PRF skill in tandem with one another. So units like Emblem Sigurd or Attuned Micaiah, for example, you know, everybody's favorite. However, I do believe that there's been a much bigger emphasis on the skills doing a large amount of the heavy lifting, PRF or not. That being said, they've definitely gotten much more creative comparatively to last book, so I can't really criticize them as much on that front. Still, I think I started noticing this a lot more ever since Summer Hrid was announced. My initial impression came from only reading his weapon that was arguably extremely mediocre even by book 8 standards, but when reading his PRF B slot, everything changed. At least unlike many newer PRF skills, his was shorter than his weapon, but it really had a lot going for it since it had a good amount of effects that allowed him to stand out quite a bit. And then after looking back at all sorts of units over the past book, a lot of them kinda had similar traits. This isn't something that applies to every unit, of course, but it feels like that's been the case for so many of them. Granted, some units like Rearmed would automatically fall into that archetype because they don't have a PRF weapon to call their own, but for the ones that did, it became fairly apparent which part of their kit was doing more of the work. And speaking of which, I think the emphasis on skill creep also bleeds into how valuable some types of units are. For example, take a look at the gimmick heroes that we have. You know, Ascended, Rearmed, Attuned, Aided. Ascended heroes are basically just regular 5 stars, and you know, sometimes they'll get a PRF skill, but generally speaking, they are basically just premium 5 stars that give extra gimmicks and blah blah blah. Nothing really spectacular. Rearms have an inheritable PRF, but they do get their own PRF skill to keep them at least a bit distinct, and with a recent update, they are allowed to use other rearms and X slots in tandem with their PRF skill. Meanwhile, attuned units get a PRF skill, and can use any X slot or rearmed weapon, and while Aided is still fairly new, it is currently just following a PRF and PRF skill thing only, and they can't use X slots, and maybe an update in the future will change that, but for the time being, these are the 4 gimmick heroes that we just have cycling around in the pool. And when you really put them all side by side, it's clear that attuned units are inherently the strongest unit type that we have in the game. Even amongst legendaries and mythics and emblems, at least at a base level, since they can get access to a guaranteed PRF, PRF skill, X slots, the ability to swap out their X slots for any future ones, and can take advantage of miscellaneous bonuses that mythics can't use and legendaries only when they're in season. This doesn't guarantee they'll be good, of course, but having access to 2 guaranteed PRFs and X slots on top of that means they're naturally starting out at a much higher level over any other unit type. They still need good effects and gimmicks to really work, but when the unit can get access to several more at a base level, it's going to be difficult for them to not be useful in some capacity. This is especially huge given that many units rely on strong effects to be able to perform at a considerable level, whereas many were able to simply get away with just stats in the past. Missing out on an effect or two can mean a lot for a unit, but what those would ultimately be depends on the role itself. And for an attuned unit, they are definitely ahead of the curve over most, if not every other unit type in the game. Despite that, with the type of skills that dropped this year alone, you could get away with a surprising amount of stuff even on unit types that don't really have as much benefits. So much so that I think much of the push from this year's Insanity came from the inheritable side, and this does extend to emblems as well. We've had really good inheritables through the entirety of the game, of course, but as far as the upgrades were concerned, a lot of them were upgraded in ways that either felt like the same but a bit more, or made older skills serve some kind of purpose after. Not to undermine some of them or just, properly describe what an upgrade is, because the last book gave us a lot of nice stuff such as guidance skills, and they're extremely relevant still, guard bearing, times pulse, etc, etc. Point being, upgrades effectively took the base effect and tuned it up to an extent that made it worthwhile and recognizable. And then you have Breath of Life 4. Breath of Life 4 to me is what Hardy Fighter was back when it first debuted. An extremely overtuned skill that completely changed the landscape of the game and should not have been released in the state that it was, at least that early into the game. It is not like any other upgrade we've seen because it doesn't even retain the original base effect of post-combat healing. Now it's start a turn healing with extra stats, reduces deep wound effects, and it's a joint drive, so you don't even need to have it on your main tank. It is so overtuned that not having it in some capacity is ultimately a net negative, and it is arguably the best skill of 2024, at least so far. And while it's definitely one of the outlier upgrades of the year, we've definitely had many skills that got massive jumps in quality, including Flow Guard inflicting Scowl, Odd Speed Wave granting no follow-up for some reason, Odd Defense Wave granting full tempo for some reason, Twin Saves making armored specials significantly more useful, and so on. And that's only on the upgraded side of inherits. You have Lagoo's Friend 4, which completely revitalized infantry tanks, Shield Fighter, which took what was arguably one of the best B slots ever released and tuned it up even more for armors, Devoted Basket, which at its peak was arguably the most broken inheritable weapon ever, so much so that most red tomes were using it over their PRFs, including the modern released ones. Soaring Echo, which allowed flyers to provide even more support, as well as all the emblem effects that allow so many new roles for so many types of units. Granted, they're not inheritable skills, but they are extra effects that can be tacked onto any unit so long as you can summon for the emblem associated with it. There's been so much brought into this game from Book 8 alone that it makes me question how they could push the limits of it even more. What more could they possibly do beyond additional skill slots and granting extra effects via emblems? Whatever it might be, I believe it will still be through more and more skill creep until Book 8 seems like it was one of the more basic years of FEH. But who knows, maybe I'll look back at this video in a year and find myself in the same position as I am with the older power creep video. But I do think skill creep has definitely taken the forefront more over power creep. That's just me though. I think a lot of us also tend to look at the latest and greatest scary or strong thing and then reflect back on how we missed the old power creep, so it's entirely plausible that it just happens again. The game changes way too fast, especially nowadays, where you'd be lucky to have a unit last more than 3 months, as a new unit. So for all I know, everything can flip on its head in a week. And because of that, I can still stand by the idea that power creep has lost all meaning so long ago, because continually chasing it is not nearly as feasible as it once was. It's predictable, yet unpredictable at the same time, which, for what it's worth, keeps the state of the game interesting, and I would say Book 8, for the most part, has accomplished that very well. That being said, if I ever end up saying something along the lines of, this current unit is so annoying, I miss the Emblem Sigurd days, then I'd probably have to stop talking about power creep at that point.